It was June of 2016. I vividly remember being in the consultation room where the doctors had diagnosed my uncle with stage 4 rectal cancer. This was the first time the blissful ignorance in my euphoric mini-world had been shattered. The first time the concept of death had ever arisen in my mind. The first time I saw sorrow, anger, and terror surge up on my always cheerful uncle's face. But even though his logical thoughts were overcast by a storm of confusion, his fear of death remained crystal clear. From the operating theater to chemotherapy, my uncle tried every treatment medicine had to offer to conquer the cancer in his body. But even that was not enough. I saw my uncle, the one who used to attend my childish tea parties, become bedridden, slowly lose his hair, his complexion fairing, and bruises marking his body as a result of chemotherapy. In months, I saw my uncle turn from someone I knew to someone I could not recognize, to someone who was tired of fighting, someone who was suffering. To this day, there are many questions that still perplex me. Why do we fight death? Why do we avoid death? Why, despite knowing the painful side effects of chemotherapy, would my uncle choose to die with chemo in his veins instead of passing peacefully? The answer is the uncertainty of death. The fear of the unknown pain and the fear of suffering causes our primal instincts to fight, to avoid death. Yet, I can't help but wonder if undergoing chemotherapy just to fight for a longer life had brought more suffering than happiness to my uncle. So let me ask, is the obstination of prolonging mortality always the best outcome? Now, to be very clear here, as a healthy and well 17-year-old, there's no way I'd relate to the pain and suffering of a terminally ill patient. In no way, shape, or form am I trying to neglect their feelings, nor am I trying to dismiss the doctor's suggestions of treatments for them. This speech is not about giving up. I'm not saying that chemotherapy is ineffective, but that there is a problem with our perspective, our concept of death. Society has ingrained a schema of death as dark and agonizing, when really, it is a natural process. Death is not a possibility, but an inevitability. It is not a matter of chance, but a matter of time. Aging is no longer natural, but a medical process of sustaining mortality instead. But when faced with an unfortunate prognosis that could result in death, the obstination of treatments will only make the fighting more futile, the suffering more torturous, and the death more painful. In modern society, the unspoken rules ingrained in doctors are to heal the sick, prolong mortality, and to ensure every patient lives. And indeed, this is essential, as all the medics would agree in this room, that one of the most attractive qualities of being a doctor is to be able to save lives. However, there is a fundamental aspect we have missed: priorities. When faced with frailty, we think our top priority is to ensure longevity. But what if it's something more than that? This was the case of Alice Hobson. At the age of 84, her deteriorating health has forced her to move into an isolated cell, or as we call it, a nursing home unit. Her daily activities of eating, sleeping, reading all became subject to the monotonous mechanical schedule of institutional life. Yeah, she was secure. She was protected. But she was not living. There were so many more things Alice wanted to accomplish. She wanted to knit. She wanted to bake cookies for her grandchildren. She wanted to make her own clothes. Now her daily activities consisted of bingo, board games, or folding paper cranes. Alice yearned for her friendships. She missed going to the gym with Polly. She missed having her own privacy, but most importantly, she missed having a purpose to live. On one fateful morning, Alice developed severe abdominal pain and began coughing blood. She didn't tell the nurses about it. She didn't press the emergency button that was right next to her, but she chose to remain silent. The next day, Alice died. But the abdominal pain was a problem that simple medicine could cure. But her problem was never her pain to begin with, but that she didn't feel like she had a purpose to live anymore. The doctors ordered her to sleep at 9, wake up at 9, forbid her from eating cookies, and told her to eat porridge instead. How could Alice have appreciated the simple things that brought her joy when she was so constrained to the mini cubicle of a cell? She didn't have control over her life anymore. She couldn't do the simple things by herself anymore. How could she live when living was suffering? Medicine's concern was to prolong her life, to keep her heart beating, and to prioritize her safety. But at the expense of what? Her autonomy was ripped away from her, and her priorities became neglected. Alice's concern was not to have her life prolonged, but to prolong her time spent with her loved ones and to spend her remaining days on the things she enjoyed the most. Doctors have priorities of persevering life, but the dying, they have priorities merely other than sustaining life and living longer. Alice, like many others, had reasons why she wanted to be alive, to want to keep going. Medical school teaches doctors how to save lives, and rightfully so, but it lacks emphasis on tending to a patient's demise. Sudden epilepsy in the middle of the night, presented to the emergency room. Discovery of a brain tumor, we will have it removed in the operating theater right away. Each individual's case, their problems fixable with years of experience with a scalpel. But when presented with the unfixable, such as a 7-year-old terminally ill patient with dementia and arthritis, our first response is to give more drugs, more surgeries, more ventilation to sustain life. But when life becomes condensed to only stethoscopes, syringes, and IV fluids, are we really living? Or are we just grasping at survival here? Not only has medicine failed to recognize a patient's priorities, it has also made the process of dying more painful. The National Cancer Institute states that nausea and vomiting occurs in 80% of chemotherapy patients. And according to the National Library of Medicine, between 30 to 40% of neurotoxic chemotherapy recipients develop nerve pain as a side effect of chemotherapy. This reminds me of a quote from Christian Bernard, a South African cardiac surgeon to perform the first heart transplant. The prime goal is to alleviate suffering and not to prolong life. And if your treatment does not alleviate suffering but only prolongs life, then that treatment should be stopped. Modern medicine's approach to mortality, treating it as if it was another human body condition to be fixed, has caused mass suffering to those at their end of lives. And we must gravitate from our current perspective. Mortality should not just be in relation to persevering life, but what it means to live a very good life to the very end. And in order to achieve this, we must respect a patient's choices and autonomy. Currently, there are a few countries in which assisted dying has been legalized, including Canada and Belgium. What this process means is that it allows for terminally ill patients to reflect and decide on their circumstances, and to have doctors assessing which patients would be viable for such procedures. However, there are many countries in which this process is still prohibited, such as in the UK. According to statistics, 92% of people who are living off of pension stated that doctors should be able to provide the means of assisted dying if a terminally ill patient wishes to die. Yet by trying to enforce moral equivalence, making assisted dying illegal, medicine has failed to recognize a patient's priorities, and the society of free will that we try to strive for becomes prevented. Those who disagree with the legalization of assisted dying may say that such practices could convey a message of devaluing lives or being unsafe. However, there are many countries which actually contradict this. In the USA, the legalization of assisted dying has been passed in the state of Oregon and remains unchanged since 1997, and is also in place in the state of California. Striving for the legalization of assisted dying does not mean it is imperative for each individual to go through such processes. After all, in the 20 years in which assisted dying has been made legal in the state of Oregon, only 12,000 deaths had occurred, which totals up to about 60 deaths per year. Perhaps all patients want right now is to have a conversation about the end of life, and not to avoid conversations about death. As I grow older, I've realized that what makes life worth living, even in face of death, is not to avoid the hard stuff or to avoid conversations about death, but learning to accept it. People, my uncle feared death because it was uncertain. And limiting our choices and conversations will only add on to this. The undeniable truth is that not everything will be fixable by medicine, and in circumstances where a patient's condition is no longer treatable, it is fundamental to understand a patient's priorities, and not just their human anatomy. Is it the clock that they want to extend? Or is it the quality of time? And both are okay. And it's okay to say no to treatment options that aren't right for you. Medicine's role is not to fight fate, but to help a patient through their pain and make it okay even when it is not okay, to make the unbearable bearable. And perhaps only until we come to terms with death itself and be able to make our final decision will death seem all the less frightening. Thank you.